I present to you for perhaps the millionth time the Kalam Cosmological argument. Now, I know what you're thinking. I know we've heard it all before, but he's got a little bit of a different take on it.
The first one is everything that begins to exist has a cause. I'll argue for that, okay? I think it's actually obviously true, but we'll look at it. The universe began to exist. If everything that begins to exist has a cause, and the universe began to exist, then it follows, logically, the conclusion is, therefore, the universe has a cause.
Okay, so that's the argument. And the problem is with each of these premises, everything that begins to exist has a cause. How do we know that? Sure, it may seem reasonable, it may make sense intuitively, but what actual proof do we have of this? Can we have proof of this? This is an assumption that is made, and perhaps it's a reasonable assumption, but it's not something that we can completely know for sure. And the second premise is that the universe began to exist. And this is probably true, but it's more complicated than that, and we'll talk about that later. But the conclusion is that the universe has a cause, but that doesn't mean that God did it. It doesn't mean that God is the most reasonable explanation for that. And Tim states that he will show us why God is the best explanation for it, so we'll get on to that later.
Whatever begins to exist must have a cause for its existence. So babies, bouquets, and root beer all have a cause for their existence. Parents make babies, florists make bouquets, A&W makes their delicious, and it really is delicious. And I notice you guys, if you go home today, okay, you go home from this conference and you find an iPhone sitting on the dining room table, it would be irrational to think that it just popped into existence uncaused, out of nothing, and just appeared in your house.
Okay, sure, the things that he listed here do indeed have a cause. But we also understand these causes. We understand how these things are made. We understand the concept of conception and pregnancy, as well as the concept of manufacturing for things like computers and soda pop. But since we make these things, it does not logically follow that everything is made in the same way. You're saying that we make certain things, therefore everything is made. That's a jump in logic.
And so that's the first premise. I think we all believe that's true. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. What about the second premise, that the universe began to exist? Well, let's look at kind of the beginning of this idea that the universe began to exist. And this goes back about 100 years. Now, it turns out for centuries, it was believed by most atheists that the universe is uncaused and eternal. If it's eternal, then you can get away from the cause, okay? And Christians, on the other hand, have always affirmed, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So there was a beginning to the universe. And up until the 20th century, there was no way to tell scientifically who was right. There were some philosophical arguments, but nothing from science to say one way or the other. That all changed with Albert Einstein and his famous theory of general theory of relativity in 1915. And in his equation, he noticed, and I mean, I'm sure you can all see it here, that from that equation, that the universe is either expanding or contracting. Now, Einstein didn't like that for a couple reasons. For one, well, when he looked up at the night sky, it didn't look like it was expanding or contracting. Okay, so he didn't like that. And the next thing was that, well, if the universe is expanding, then that means yesterday it was closer together. And if you go back far enough, you reach a beginning point to the universe. And a beginning implies a beginner. And Einstein didn't like that, okay? And so what he did was he added a constant, what he called a fudge factor, to his equation that kept the universe static. Not actually, but the equation said that the universe was now not expanding, but static.
Okay, that's not how it happened. The details are correct, but the reasons are completely wrong. Yes, for a long time, scientists did think that the universe was static, but Einstein's theory of relativity did not disprove this. See, at this point in time, Einstein was still coming up with his theory of relativity. He was still trying to figure out if this was true. He was still trying to solve it for certain things. And he didn't add this fudge factor because he didn't want there to be a god. But instead, the idea of a static universe was the accepted view at the time. There wasn't any real reason to think otherwise. And it was only a year after Einstein came up with this that it was shown that the universe is expanding. And when he was shown that, he readily dropped the idea. And by the way, Einstein didn't call this a fudge factor. That's just what we call such ad hoc additions. But my point is, Einstein wasn't hiding from God. Instead, there was no indication that the universe wasn't static. He spends a lot of time explaining Edwin Hubble's proof that the universe is expanding, and yes, it is true. Eventually, he gets around to saying this.
Check this out. If you go back in time, you end up getting to a beginning point of the universe. Not just a beginning to space, but as Einstein said, space and time are related. And that is, it's a beginning point in time as well. There's a time when time began, okay? There's a time when space began. In fact, if you can't even talk about before this because then your mind melts because there was no time before. And so at this point, you have matter, energy, space, and time all coming into existence.
Wait, you just said that space and time began to exist. That doesn't mean that matter and energy began to exist as well. Because according to the traditional model of the universe, in the beginning there was the initial singularity, which included all of the mass, matter, and energy that is in the universe today. And that formed space-time and then expanded. But eventually this model has been discredited because it fails to accurately predict certain things in quantum mechanics, which I'm not going to pretend like I understand. But different models that could better explain things have been proposed, such as cyclical universes, where big bangs are eventually followed by big crunches and then the cycle starts over again. We'll talk about that later. But there's also the idea of multiverses, which is more reasonable. But Tim here doesn't go into the idea of the multiverse, and he doesn't explain why that's unreasonable.
So let me give you another one. It's called the second law of thermodynamics. It is one of the most established laws in science, okay? The second law of thermodynamics basically says this. The universe as a whole is running out of usable energy, okay? It's kind of like a car. You fill up your car with usable energy, and over time, it runs out of gas, okay? Well, our universe is a lot like that. Well, think about this. If we went into the parking lot right now and we found a car running, you would know for certain that that car had not been running from eternity. Because if it had been running from eternity, that is always run, it would have run out of gas by now. The only thing that makes sense is that our car was filled up a finite time ago and it's running and soon it's going to run out. But it hasn't fully run out yet. There's gas in the tank. In the same way, we look at our universe, hey, there's still usable energy out there. Our universe must have a beginning, okay?
Okay, yes, this is essentially true. The second law of thermodynamics states that the energy within our universe is becoming less and less usable. So that does indicate that there was a finite point in the past where everything began. Unless you consider dark energy. But that's because we don't really understand the nature of dark energy, and it allows a lot of speculation. Okay, the idea of a cyclical universe isn't actually that credible. But the entirety of the beginning of the universe is speculative in nature, and probably won't be anything more than that. It's probably not able to be anything more than that. The only thing that we can really conclude about the beginning of the universe is that it actually did happen. But we can't pinpoint a certain cause, including God.
This is not a Christian scientist, not even close. And he says this: all of the evidence, not some of it, all the evidence we have says the universe has a beginning.
Let's look at the context of this quote. In this article, Vilenkin refutes 3 models of the universe. One is eternal inflation, another is the cosmic egg, which has the idea that the universe was static and then expanded, and another is the cyclical universe. And there are more models of the universe than that. In fact, looking through Vilenkin's works, it seems like he subscribes to the multiverse hypothesis, or at least thinks it plausible. Not to mention the fact that in this article that I found, he says that he doesn't think it proves God either way. Yes, he's saying that the universe had a beginning, and yeah, he's almost certainly true. But that doesn't mean that we understand the nature of this beginning.
So evidence is on the side of the theist in this situation, not the atheist.
No, not yet. Evidence of a beginning is not the same as evidence of a God. In order for God to be the most reasonable explanation for this beginning, you need to have proof of God so that it can explain the beginning. If we don't understand something, like the beginning of the universe, we can't just say, God did it, and that's just the most reasonable explanation. This is the God of the gaps, and it's not reasonable. All it is, it's a patch to put on something that we don't know so that we can have some sort of peace of mind.
With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They must face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Now, it's very interesting the words he chose. The problem of a cosmic beginning? It's not a problem for me, folks. Why would people be hiding behind the possibility of a past eternal universe? Because a past eternal universe gets rid of they think gets rid of the idea of God. I actually think it doesn't.
No, that's not why scientists want there to be an eternal universe. If there's an eternal universe, if there's no exact beginning, then that answers a lot of hard questions about the beginning of the universe. But in no way does this prove a God. Again, we can't just take things we don't know and say God done it. In order for God to be the most reasonable explanation, we need proof of that God. And having something that we don't know is not that proof. But you talk about his wording, so let's look at his wording. He says cosmic beginning and past eternal universe. See, he's still open to the idea of the universe being caused by something outside of the universe, not necessarily metaphysical in nature. In fact, that's what he's talking about in the book that this is cited from. Newsflash, it's not about the God of the Bible, it's about the multiverse. But I suppose he'll explain later why God is the most reasonable explanation, so we'll go down that road then. But this is it for this video. If you want to find me on the internet, I'm on Twitter, Discord, MySpace, Craigslist, eBay, RandNet, LimeWire, FarmersOnly.com, eHarmony, RV House, PS2 Network, iFunny, Instagram, whatever you want.